Between the frigid evening of February 8th and the dawn of February 9th, 1988, 15 young men were eliminated across Brooklyn's Red Hook neighborhood in what would become known as the Valentine Massacre. All gang members, all connected to the Red Hook Disciples Street crew. The method was execution-style shootings across 7 locations in less than 12 hours. The perpetrators weren't rival gangs or drug cartels or organized crime syndicates. They were 4 members of the Moretti family, a father and his 3 surviving sons, moving through Brooklyn like avenging spirits, methodically erasing everyone who'd been present at a betrayal that cost them everything. The NYPD would later classify it as one of the most calculated gang eliminations in New York City history. But the motive wasn't territory, wasn't a drug dispute, wasn't even traditional mob business. It was a setup during a peace meeting that left 21-year-old Joey Moretti bleeding out on a warehouse floor, while his father held him and his brothers swore vengeance. And one man, Vincent Moretti, 58 years old, who believed that when someone murders your son under a flag of peace, the only language they understand is written in bullets and measured in bodies. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events that shattered Red Hook forever. Red Hook, Brooklyn, wasn't much more than 3 square miles of crumbling waterfront and housing projects in February of 1988. Population hovering around 10,000, down from 15,000 a decade earlier, as white flight continued its relentless exodus. The neighborhood was bounded by the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway to the east, the Gowanus Canal to the north, Upper New York Bay to the west, and the industrial wasteland of the Brooklyn waterfront to the south. What remained was a fractured community, old Italian and Irish families clinging to rent-controlled apartments and fading memories, surrounded by the Red Hook houses, 11 buildings of public housing that had become a fortress for a new generation that didn't remember or care about the old neighborhood codes. February in Red Hook meant temperatures dropping to 23 degrees at night, rising to maybe 38 by afternoon if you were lucky. The air smelled like salt water from the harbor, diesel fuel from container ships, and the particular metallic scent of urban decay that comes when a neighborhood is dying but refuses to admit it yet. The winter of 1988 hit New York City with a brutality that felt personal. By February, the city had already recorded 213 homicides, a pace that would make it one of the deadliest years in modern history. But Red Hook's violence had a different quality than Manhattan's crack wars or the Bronx's gang battles. Here, violence was intimate. Violence was personal, a neighborhood eating itself from the inside while the rest of the city looked away. The waterfront had been Red Hook's heart for over a century. Italian immigrants had worked the docks since the 1890s, unloading ships, running legitimate businesses and illegitimate ones, side by side, building a community where everyone knew everyone and the rules were clear, even if they weren't legal. By 1988, containerization had killed most of those jobs. The piers sat empty except for the occasional freighter. The Longshoremen's Union Hall on Columbia Street looked like a mausoleum. old men gathering to remember better days while their sons and grandsons looked elsewhere for work that didn't exist. The Red Hook houses had been built in 1939 as part of the New York City Housing Authority's ambitious plans to provide decent homes for working families. 49 years later, they'd become something else entirely. 30 buildings spread across 3 separate complexes, home to over 6,000 residents, predominantly Black and Latino families who'd arrived during the 60s and 70s as the Italian and Irish populations fled to Staten Island and Long Island. The projects weren't quite as notorious as Brownsville or the South Bronx, but they were getting there. Crack cocaine had arrived in 1986, and by early '88, Red Hook was drowning in it. At night, when temperatures dropped toward freezing, you could hear the neighborhood settling into its routines. The rattle of the elevated subway on Smith Street 3 blocks away, the foghorns from ships passing through the harbor, the bass from car stereos playing Run DMC and Public Enemy, and underneath it all, the sound of violence. Sporadic gunfire that residents had learned to identify by caliber and distance. The way farmers recognize different bird calls. 9mm from the projects, probably a robbery. 45 from near the waterfront, probably mob business. Shotgun from Van Brunt Street, probably someone defending their store. The sounds of a neighborhood that had normalized warfare. Vincent Anthony Moretti was 58 years old that February, though he looked a decade older. He stood 5 feet 11 inches, but his posture, stooped from 30 years of dock work and another decade of running a small shipping company, made him appear shorter. His face was deeply lined, Mediterranean skin weathered by salt air and sun, a thick scar running from his left temple to his jaw, souvenir from a bar fight in 1963 that had nearly killed him. His hands were massive, knuckles swollen from old breaks that had never set quite right, calluses thick as leather from decades of physical labor that had defined his existence. Every morning, Vincent woke at 5:30 in the house on Coffee Street, where he'd lived since 1956, the year after he came home from the Army. The house was narrow, 3 stories, of red brick pressed between identical structures, row houses built in the 20s when Red Hook was thriving. He'd make coffee in a percolator his wife Carmela had bought in '62. Strong enough to fuel a longshoreman through a 12-hour shift. He'd smoke 2 Camel cigarettes on the back steps, regardless of temperature, and watch the sun try to rise over Brooklyn, though the warehouse buildings usually blocked any real view. By 6:30, he'd be at Moretti Shipping on Van Brunt Street, a small office attached to a warehouse where legitimate freight moved through Red Hook to destinations across the tri-state area. The business wasn't large, maybe 8 employees, but it was honest work that kept the family fed and maintained Vincent's standing in the neighborhood. He'd married Carmela Louise DeLuca in 1957, right after he came home from Fort Bragg with an honorable discharge and a chest full of medals he kept in a drawer and never discussed. They'd had 4 sons. Anthony was 32 now, running most of the day-to-day shipping operations. Carlo was 30, handling the warehouse. Michael was 28, managing accounts. And Joey, the youngest at 21, was still finding his way, working odd jobs, talking about maybe going to community college. Still young enough to believe the future held something better than Red Hook's slow death. What Vincent valued most wasn't money, though God knew they needed it. What he valued was respect, the old neighborhood concept that had kept Red Hook functioning when official institutions failed. The Red Hook disciples hadn't existed 5 years earlier. Street gangs had always been present in the projects, loose affiliations, based on buildings or blocks, but they'd been disorganized, focused on petty crime, kept in check by older residents and the constant presence of longshoremen who wouldn't tolerate major violence near their work. Then crack arrived in 1986, and everything changed. Suddenly, there was real money on the streets, more cash than most of these kids had seen in their lives, and with that money came guns, violence, and a complete collapse of whatever informal rules had previously governed Red Hook's underworld. Marcus Collins Williams, who everyone called MC, was 25 years old that winter, though he carried himself with the authority of someone much older. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, lean and athletic, with a baby face that made him look almost innocent until you saw his eyes, which held the flat, affectless stare of someone who'd seen too much death, too young. He'd grown up in the Red Hook East houses, Building 5, Apartment 3D, third of 4 children raised by a mother who worked double shifts at Kings County Hospital, and a father who disappeared when Marcus was 6. He dropped out of John Jay High School in 10th grade, got arrested twice for assault before he was 18, did 6 months at Rikers that taught him everything he needed to know about violence and nothing about avoiding it. The disciples were his creation, formed in late '86 when crack money made it possible to actually organize. They weren't sophisticated like the old mob families, didn't have the structure of the Bloods or Crips that were spreading from the West Coast. They were purely local, 15 to 20 core members, all from the projects, all young, all armed, all convinced. They were building an empire in 3 square miles of forgotten Brooklyn. They controlled crack distribution in the houses, ran protection rackets on local businesses, and were starting to eye the waterfront operations that had always been Italian territory. Marcus wasn't stupid, despite what Vincent Moretti and the old Italians thought. He understood that taking the waterfront meant war with people who'd been running it for 3 generations. But he also understood that those people were dying out. Joseph Michael Moretti, called Joey by everyone who knew him, was 21 years old and caught between 2 worlds that were moving toward inevitable collision. He'd been born in 1967, the tail end of the baby boom, young enough that Red Hook's transformation from Italian neighborhood to something else entirely had been his entire lived experience, where his older brothers remembered the neighborhood before white flight, before the crack epidemic, before the violence became normalized. Joey had grown up knowing Red Hook only in its decline. And somehow that made him different. He didn't carry the same anger, the same resentment, the same rigid adherence to the old codes that defined his father and brothers. He stood 5 feet 10 inches, slighter build than his brothers, with his mother's softer features and his father's dark eyes. He'd graduated from John Jay High School in '85, one of only 3 Italian kids in his class. The rest, Black and Latino kids from the projects. He'd played basketball with them, dated their sisters, learned their slang, and their music existed in a cultural space his brothers couldn't access and his father couldn't understand. After graduation, he'd worked for his father's shipping company, but his heart wasn't in it. He talked about community college, about maybe becoming a teacher or social worker, careers his father considered pointless and his brothers saw as weak. Joey's girlfriend, Maria Elena Rodriguez, was 19, Puerto Rican, beautiful in a way that made Joey forget about Red Hook's decay when he was with her. They'd met at a block party in summer of '87, started dating despite her family's concerns about her being with an Italian and his family's barely concealed racism. Maria lived in building 7 of the Red Hook houses with her mother and 2 younger sisters. Her father had died in '83, construction accident that left the family struggling. Her older brother, Ramon, was deep in the Disciples, one of Marcus Williams's top enforcers, a fact that complicated everything but also gave Joey unique access to both worlds. By January of '88, Joey had become an unofficial mediator. When tensions rose between the Disciples and the old Italian businesses, when protection money demands got too aggressive, when young Disciples tried to push into waterfront operations, Joey could make calls, arrange conversations, smooth things over. His father didn't like it, thought Joey was too soft, too willing to compromise with people Vincent considered thugs and criminals. But even Vincent had to admit it was useful, having someone who could talk to both sides. The tension that had been building through January finally demanded resolution on the 28th, a Thursday afternoon, when temperatures dropped to 19 degrees and the wind off the harbor felt like knives. Vincent Moretti received a call at his office around 2:15 from Detective Sarah Rodriguez, Maria's aunt, who worked out of the 76th precinct. She wasn't calling officially, just giving a heads up the way old neighborhood connections worked. The Disciples were planning something, she said. Word on the street was they were tired of negotiating, tired of the old Italians controlling the waterfront. Things were about to get ugly unless someone intervened. Vincent hung up and stared at the shipping manifests on his desk for 10 minutes without seeing them. He was tired, bone tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. He'd spent 30 years navigating Red Hook's underworld, maintaining the delicate balance between legitimate business and the darker necessities that kept his family fed and safe. He'd paid protection when he had to, collected it when he could, settled disputes with words when possible and violence when necessary. But he was 58 years old, and the world had changed in ways that made his experience feel obsolete. These weren't mob soldiers following omerta and respecting hierarchies. These were kids with automatic weapons and crack money, who didn't care about the old rules because nobody had ever taught them there were rules. He called Joey at 6 that evening. His youngest son arrived at the house on Coffee Street by 7, found his father in the kitchen drinking Dewar's straight, no ice, the bottle a quarter empty already. Carmela was upstairs, knew better than to interfere when Vincent was working through something. Anthony, Carlo, and Michael were there too, summoned by calls that had gone out an hour earlier. The 4 sons sat around the kitchen table where they'd eaten thousands of meals, where Vincent's father had sat before him, where decisions had been made that shaped Red Hook for 3 generations. "We need to meet with Williams," Vincent said. No preamble, no explanation needed. His sons understood immediately. A sit-down, old school, to establish terms before the situation exploded. Joey, you set it up. You got the connections. Tell them we come in good faith, unarmed, to talk about how we coexist without bloodshed. Anthony shifted in his chair. You really think they'll honor that? Vincent looked at his oldest son. We honor it. That's what matters. We show them we're reasonable men willing to negotiate. If they're smart, they negotiate back. If they're not, he didn't finish the sentence. The warehouse sat on Beard Street, 3 blocks from the waterfront, a cavernous brick structure built in 1923 that now sat mostly empty, except for the occasional shipment Vincent stored there. Neutral territory, or as neutral as anything got in Red Hook. The meeting was set for 11:30, late enough that the streets would be empty, early enough that both sides could get home at a reasonable hour. Vincent had insisted on those details. Everything proper, everything respectful. They'd arrive with 5 men, Vincent and his 4 sons. The disciples would bring the same. No weapons, just talk. Vincent drove his 1984 Cadillac DeVille, Anthony in the passenger seat, the 3 younger sons in back. The temperature had dropped to 17 degrees, the dashboard thermometer glowing green in the darkness. Nobody spoke during the 10-minute drive from Coffee Street to Beard. They'd already said everything that needed saying. Joey had made the arrangements through Maria, who'd gotten word to her brother Ramon, who'd brought it to Marcus Williams. The response had come back affirmative within 2 hours. 11:30 Beard Street warehouse, 5 on 5, no weapons, talk about territory and money, and how to avoid a war. Nobody wanted. They pulled up to the warehouse at 11:27. The building loomed against the night sky. 3 stories of brick with windows that had been broken out years ago and never replaced. A single security light cast yellow illumination across the loading dock. Vincent could see another car already there. A 1986 Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme he recognized as belonging to Marcus Williams. Good. Punctuality suggested seriousness. He turned off the engine, looked at his sons. Remember, we're here to talk. Show respect. Don't react to anything they say. We're the reasonable ones. They all nodded. Joey looked nervous, kept glancing toward the warehouse door. Michael put a hand on his younger brother's shoulder. It'll be fine, just like you set it up. They walked across the frozen pavement toward the warehouse's side entrance, their breath visible in the frigid air. Vincent opened the door, the hinges screaming rust. Inside was darker than he'd expected, just a few work lights set up in the center of the vast space, creating a pool of illumination surrounded by shadows. He could see 5 figures standing in that light. Marcus Williams in the center, recognizable even in silhouette. 4 others flanking him. Vincent Moretti carried his youngest son's body up the steps of his Coffee Street house at 1:43 in the morning on February 9th. Joey had died at 12:58 in the back seat of Anthony's car, while Carlo pressed his jacket against the wounds, trying to stop bleeding that wouldn't stop, while Michael drove like a madman toward Maimonides Medical Center, while Vincent held his son's head, and Joey's eyes went from confused to terrified to empty in the span of 9 minutes. They'd never made it to the hospital. Anthony had pulled over on Columbia Street, checked for a pulse. he knew wouldn't be there, and said, "He's gone, Pop. He's gone." Vincent had sat there for 5 minutes, still holding Joey, before saying, "Take him home. Take my boy home." Carmela was waiting on the porch, despite the cold, wrapped in the wool coat Vincent had bought her for their 30th anniversary. She knew before they got out of the car. A mother always knows. She didn't scream, didn't cry, just walked down the steps and pulled the car door open and looked at her baby boy's face, pale in the streetlight, blood soaked through his shirt and jacket, eyes still open because nobody'd thought to close them. She reached in with one hand and closed them gently, like she was putting a child to sleep. Then she looked at Vincent. They killed him. It wasn't a question. Vincent nodded. Under a flag of peace. I want to see. So they carried Joey into the house, the 5 of them, laid him on the kitchen table where Carmela had served him breakfast that morning, where he'd eaten cereal and complained about the cold and said he had a good feeling about this meeting, that maybe they could actually prevent the war. Everyone saw coming. The bullet had entered just below Joey's left collarbone, angled down through his lung and heart, exited through his back. Death would have taken between 3 and 7 minutes, long enough to know he was dying, short enough that there was mercy in it. There were 2 other wounds, defensive, through his left hand where he'd raised it, through his right shoulder. He'd been standing in front of Vincent when the shooting started. First shot, maybe the only one intended for him, or maybe they'd meant to kill all 5 Morettis, and Joey was just fastest to react. Either way, he'd taken bullets meant for his father. Maria Rodriguez arrived at 2:30, brought by her Aunt Sarah, who'd gotten word through police channels about shots fired at the Beard Street warehouse. Vincent sat at his kitchen table for 3 hours after Maria left, smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee that had gone cold and bitter. Carmela had finally gone upstairs around 5 in the morning, exhausted by grief, her prayers for restraint and mercy falling on deaf ears. Joey's body remained on the table, covered now with a sheet, because Vincent wouldn't let them take him away yet, needed him there as evidence, as justification, as the reason for what came next. Anthony, Carlo, and Michael sat with him, waiting for their father to speak, to give the order they all knew was coming. At 5:45, as weak winter light began, filtering through the kitchen windows, Vincent stubbed out his 30th cigarette and said, "We end them. All of them. Every disciple who was in that warehouse. Everyone who knew about the setup. Everyone who pulled a trigger or stood by while my son died." His 3 surviving sons nodded. They'd been raised on stories of their grandfather, who'd run Red Hook's waterfront in the 40s and 50s, who'd enforced a code that everyone understood, who'd eliminated 3 men who'd stolen from him and dumped their bodies in the harbor. The old ways. Blood for blood. Respect through fear. Protection of family above everything, even law, even morality, even the future. Michael spoke first. "Pop, we do this. We go to prison. Life sentences. Maybe the death penalty." Vincent looked at his middle son. "Your brother's dead. They killed him under a flag of peace. That's a debt that has to be paid, no matter what it costs us. Some things matter more than freedom." Carlo asked the practical question. "How many?" Vincent pulled out a piece of paper, names Maria had given him through tears and guilt, names Sarah had confirmed through her police contacts, cross-referenced with what Vincent knew about Disciples' operations. 15. Marcus Williams and 14 others. All of them were at the warehouse or knew about the setup or helped plan it. We take them all in one night before they can scatter or reinforce. Fast, efficient, final. Anthony leaned forward. One night? 15 men? How? Vincent reached into the cabinet beneath the sink, pulled out a bottle of vodka and a rolled-up map of Red Hook. Same way you run a military operation. Intelligence, planning, execution, extraction. I learned this in the Army. You boys are going to learn it now. They spent Monday, February 9th, making calls and gathering resources. By Monday evening, February 8th, 1988, the plan was complete. Vincent had his map, marked with 15 red X's across 7 locations in Red Hook. He had 4 weapons acquired through connections to old mob families who sympathized with his situation and respected the old codes. He had ammunition, enough for what they needed to do. He had routes planned, timelines established, contingencies for if police responded faster than expected. He had the cold, methodical fury that came from grief channeled through military training and a lifetime of violence barely suppressed. Most importantly, he had 3 sons willing to follow him into hell because that's what family did, and because Joey's blood demanded an answer written in the only language the disciples understood. Carmela made dinner that evening, Monday at 6:30, around the table where Joey's body had lain until the funeral home collected him that afternoon. She cooked like she was trying to hold on to normalcy through sheer force of will. Chicken cutlets, the way Vincent liked them. Pasta with Sunday gravy she'd made yesterday, before the world ended. Salad with oil and vinegar. Bread from the bakery on Court Street. She set 5 places out of habit, then stared at the extra setting for 30 seconds before removing it, her hands shaking so badly she dropped the fork twice. Vincent and his sons ate in silence, tasting nothing, performing the ritual because it might be the last meal they ever shared outside of prison. While the Morettis ate their last free dinner, Marcus Williams was in his apartment on Dwight Street, counting money with 2 of his top lieutenants. The setup had worked perfectly. The Morettis were supposed to all die in that warehouse, eliminating the last significant Italian presence on the waterfront in one move. But something had gone wrong. Only the youngest son had been hit, and the other 4 had escaped in the confusion. Still, Marcus wasn't worried. 1 dead Moretti was enough to send a message. The old man would accept it, take his grief, maybe even come to terms, because what else could he do? Start a war at 58 years old? Marcus was 25, had 15 armed soldiers, controlled the projects. Vincent Moretti was yesterday, and yesterday didn't have power anymore. He ordered pizza, drank beer, celebrated with his crew. By midnight, he'd be the first of 15 to die, shot 3 times in his own living room by a 58-year-old man who understood exactly how to make yesterday matter one final time. The temperature had dropped to 14 degrees by 8:47 Monday evening when Vincent Moretti and his oldest son Anthony climbed the stairwell of Building 9 in the Red Hook East houses. The elevator was broken, had been for 6 months, graffiti covering every surface of the concrete stairs. They could hear bass thumping from multiple apartments, smell marijuana and cooking grease, hear arguments in Spanish and English bleeding through thin walls. This was enemy territory, the heart of Disciples' operations, and they were walking into it carrying weapons and certainty. Apartment 7D belonged to 3 disciples who'd been at the warehouse: Kareem Washington, 22, Deshaun Miller, 19, Curtis Banks, 23. Vincent knew their names, their faces from surveillance he and his sons had done all day, watching, learning patterns, understanding that these weren't soldiers or hardened criminals. They were kids, really, playing at being gangsters because the neighborhood offered nothing else. But they'd been there when Joey died, had stood by while Marcus Williams violated every code of honor, and that made them complicit. That made them targets. Anthony knocked 3 times, hard, authoritative. The music inside lowered. Footsteps. A voice. Young. Suspicious. "Who is it?" Vincent said nothing, just kicked the door where the lock met frame. 3 decades of dock work behind it. The door splintered, flew open. Kareem was standing 5 feet inside, hand reaching for his waistband where Vincent knew a 9mm waited. Vincent's Colt .45 barked once. Kareem fell backward, the shock on his face suggesting he'd never actually believed violence would find him here, in his own apartment, in his own building. Deshaun came from the bedroom, his own weapon already drawn, younger, faster. He got 1 shot off that went wide, punched through the wall near Vincent's head. Anthony fired twice from the doorway. Deshaun dropped. Curtis tried to run for the back window, maybe thinking he could climb down the fire escape. Vincent caught him in the hallway, put the barrel against the back of his head. Curtis froze. Please, man, I got a kid. Daughter's 2 years old. Lives with her mom in Flatbush. I ain't even want to be there last night. Marcus said we all had to go." Vincent thought about Joey begging for mercy he didn't get, pulled the trigger. Carlo and Michael Moretti approached the building on Van Brunt Street where 5 disciples ran their primary crack operation. Unlike the housing projects, this was a stand-alone structure. 3 stories of brick that had once been a small manufacturing facility, abandoned in the 70s, repurposed by the disciples as their main distribution point. Ground floor for sales, 2nd floor for cutting and packaging, 3rd floor for counting money and storing weapons. Everyone in the neighborhood knew what happened here. Police knew too, but resources were stretched thin, and the disciples paid enough people off that raids were rare, and always mysteriously preceded by warnings that allowed evidence to disappear. Michael carried a pump-action Mossberg 12-gauge. Carlo had a Smith & Wesson 38 Special. They weren't trying for stealth anymore. The first 3 deaths would have been discovered by now, would have police responding, would have word spreading through the streets. The disciples would be getting nervous, calling each other, maybe starting to understand what was happening. Speed mattered now more than surprise. They approached the front entrance at 10:12. The door was reinforced steel, deadbolts, designed to withstand police battering rams. Carlo looked at his brother. "Around back?" Michael shook his head, raised the shotgun, fired 3 rounds into the lock mechanism at point-blank range. The door sagged, held. He kicked it. The frame gave way. Inside was chaos. 5 disciples, all armed, all high on their own product. paranoid already and now certain they were being robbed or raided. Dwayne Peters, 24, fired first, wild shots from a Tech 9 that stitched the wall behind Carlo. Michael returned fire. The shotgun's blast, catastrophic at close range. Dwayne went down. His brother Jerome, 21, came down the stairs firing a .45, caught Carlo in the left shoulder, spun him around. Michael fired again, hit Jerome in the chest, kept moving forward. Third disciple, Marcus's cousin Andre Williams, 19, tried to surrender, hands up, weapon on the floor. Carlo, bleeding, shot him anyway. No prisoners, that's Pop said. The fourth and fifth disciples, Terrence Moore and his girlfriend Shanice Davis, were on the second floor. Terrence was 26, had been with the disciples since the beginning. Shanice was 23, wasn't in the gang, just wrong place, wrong time, there to buy crack to feed an addiction that had started 6 months ago. Vincent Moretti stood outside the apartment building on Dwight Street where Marcus Williams lived with his girlfriend, watching shadows move across drawn curtains on the third floor. Anthony was with him, arm in a sling, from where a bullet had grazed him during the trap house assault. Carlo was at Maimonides Medical Center, checked in under a false name, shoulder wound, through and through. Painful but not life-threatening. Michael was waiting in the car 2 blocks away, keeping the engine running, monitoring police radio on a scanner they'd borrowed from a sympathetic retired cop who understood what the Morettis were doing, even if he couldn't officially condone it. 7 disciples dead so far, 8 to go. But Marcus Williams was the one who mattered. The others were soldiers, following orders. Marcus had given those orders, had planned the setup, had personally fired the shots that killed Joey. The building was nicer than the projects, a 4-story walk-up in a section of Red Hook that was transitioning, young professionals starting to move in, drawn by cheap rent and proximity to Manhattan. Marcus's girlfriend, Keisha Thompson, was a nursing student at Kingsborough Community College, 23 years old, not involved in the disciples' business, kept separate from that life. Vincent knew this, had learned everything about Marcus Williams over the past 18 hours, knew he had a daughter from a previous relationship, 4 years old, lived in Queens with her mother, knew his own mother lived in the Bronx, worked as a home health aide, sent her money every month. Knew Marcus had actually been smart, could have gotten out, had scored high enough on his SATs to get into community college, but chose the streets instead because the money was immediate and the respect was intoxicating. Vincent climbed the stairs at 11:28, Anthony behind him, both of them moving quietly, despite their size and age. The hallway was clean, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, cooking smells from neighboring apartments, normal sounds of normal lives. They reached apartment 3C. Vincent could hear television inside, music, voices. He put his ear to the door. 2 people, Marcus and Keisha, laughing about something. Domestic tranquility 24 hours after murder. Vincent knocked, polite, civilized. Footsteps approached. "Who is it?" Marcus's voice, no suspicion yet. "Delivery." The door opened 6 inches, chain still attached. Marcus's face appeared in the gap, registered recognition, understanding. He tried to slam the door. Vincent's boot stopped it, shoulder hitting the wood, chain ripping from the frame. The Neptune Diner on Van Brunt Street had been serving Red Hook since 1953, a stainless steel structure that gleamed under fluorescent lights, one of those classic New York diners that served everything from eggs to meatloaf 24 hours a day. At 1:15 Tuesday morning, February 9th, 4 of the remaining disciples sat in a corner booth, drinking coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long, eating fries that had gone cold while they tried to figure out what the hell was happening. Word had spread through beepers and phone calls. 7 of their crew dead, maybe 8, conflicting reports. Marcus Williams wasn't answering his phone. Neither was his girlfriend. The police were everywhere, squad cars screaming through Red Hook, but they weren't protecting the disciples, just processing scenes, collecting bodies, interviewing witnesses who would claim they'd seen nothing. Raymond Torres, 27, the oldest of the group, kept looking at the door. "We need to get out of Red Hook. Tonight. Drive to Jersey, lay low. Figure this out when things calm down." Beside him, his younger brother Luis, 19, nodded rapidly, fear obvious in his eyes. The third man, Kenneth, KJ. Jackson, 25. Marcus's best friend since elementary school, shook his head. "We run, we look weak. The Morettis did this, has to be. Old man Vincent, crazy with grief. But he's one old man and 3 sons. We're still 15 deep, even with the losses. We stand our ground, we end them." The 4th disciple, Troy Bennett, 24, said nothing, just stared at his coffee, understanding something the others didn't. That this wasn't about numbers or strength, that they'd violated something fundamental when they killed Joey Moretti under a flag of peace. And that violation demanded a price none of them could afford to pay. Outside, Vincent Moretti sat in Anthony's Cadillac, watching the diner through plate glass windows that reflected the streetlights. Michael was beside him, shoulder bandaged but functional. Anthony had driven to Beth Israel Medical Center to check on Carlo, who'd been moved from Maimonides when police started asking questions about gunshot wounds. The 4 disciples were visible in the booth, young men trying to project confidence while terror ate them from inside. Vincent checked his Colt. 5 rounds remaining. Enough. Michael had reloaded his Mossberg. They'd have to do this in public now, no more isolated apartments or buildings. Detective Sarah Rodriguez had been awake for 27 hours straight when the full scope of what had happened across Red Hook finally became clear. She stood in the middle of the NYPD 76th Precinct briefing room at 6:30 Tuesday morning, staring at a map of Brooklyn covered with 15 red pins, each one marking a body, each one connected by lines that drew a pattern, a systematic execution that made her stomach turn. 15 young men dead across 7 locations in less than 10 hours. No witnesses willing to talk. Shell casings from 4 different weapons. A level of coordination and cold calculation that suggested military training or professional hitmen, except she knew exactly who'd done it and why. The first call had come in at 9:03 Monday night. Shots fired. Red Hook East Houses, Building 9, Apartment 7D. 3 victims, all male, all in their early 20s, all known Disciples members. She'd responded personally, climbed those stairs with a sense of dread that proved justified. Kareem Washington, Deshaun Miller, Curtis Banks. Execution style. Clean shots. No signs of struggle beyond the initial confrontation. The door kicked in, suggesting surprise attack. Neighbors heard nothing useful, saw nothing. claimed ignorance the way Red Hook residents always did when violence came calling. But Sarah knew, had known the moment she saw Kareem's face, the shock frozen there, that this was Vincent Moretti's response to Joey's murder. The second scene was worse. The trap house on Van Brunt Street, reported at 10:41 by neighbors who couldn't ignore shotgun blasts echoing through their walls. 5 more bodies. Dwayne Peters, Jerome Peters, Andre Williams, Terrence Moore, and Shanice Davis. The last one hit Sarah hardest. Shanice wasn't a disciple, wasn't even a criminal, beyond buying drugs to feed her addiction. 23 years old, caught in crossfire, found on the second floor, with a bullet through her chest, her face showing the terror of her final moments. Collateral damage. Innocent blood spilled in a war she hadn't chosen. Sarah had stood over Shanice's body and felt rage at everyone, at the disciples for creating this situation, at the Morettis for responding with mass murder, at the system that had failed Red Hook so completely that this seemed inevitable. Marcus Williams and Keisha Thompson were found at midnight by Keisha's roommate, who'd been working a late shift at Lutheran Medical Center. The apartment looked like a slaughterhouse. Marcus had been shot 4 times, once in each knee, once in the gut, once through the head. The pattern suggested torture, revenge, making him suffer before the final shot. Keisha had been in the bedroom, heard everything, called 911, while Vincent Moretti was still in her living room. Vincent Moretti sat alone on his front porch at 8:15 on Tuesday morning, February 9th, 1988. The world around him felt strangely still, as if time itself had slowed to watch what was about to unfold. His coffee had long since gone cold, but he didn't care. He wasn't there for the warmth. He was there to face what was coming. The sun struggled to rise through the industrial haze, its weak light fighting to break through the clouds that seemed to swallow everything in Red Hook. Vincent's mind wandered over the path that had led him to this moment, one of vengeance, blood, and consequences. His 3 surviving sons sat with him. Anthony, on his right, his arm in a bandage beneath his jacket, still looked like the warrior he had always been. But now, there was nothing left to fight for. Carlo had been arrested just an hour ago. He'd been picked up at Beth Israel, arrested for the trap house murders after a nurse reported his gunshot wound. Michael was on Vincent's left, his face hollow with exhaustion and the weight of the decisions they had made. Together, the Moretti men had carried out a systematic elimination of 15 people in less than 12 hours, a terrifying and brutal spree. They had crossed every line that separated law and order from chaos, and in doing so, they had become exactly what they had always claimed to fight against. At 8:23, Detective Sarah Rodriguez arrived. She drove her personal car, a 1985 Honda Accord that had clearly seen better days. The car seemed to embody the sense of inevitability hanging over them all, old, weathered, and resigned to its fate. She arrived alone, without backup, no sirens, no squad cars. It was just her, Sarah, a woman who had known the Moretti family her entire life. Her niece had loved Joey Moretti, and now Sarah's job was to arrest the very men who had destroyed her neighborhood in the name of saving it. She stepped out of the car slowly, her movements deliberate, and walked up the cracked concrete path toward the porch. The air was bitter cold, the temperature hovering just 17 degrees, and their breath lingered in the space between them, visible in the frigid air. She stood at the bottom of the steps, gazing up at Vincent. There was no rush, no need for words just yet. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of years, of choices made and blood spilled. Finally, Sarah broke the quiet. "Vincent?" she said, her voice tired, sad, barely holding back the despair. It was almost as if she were speaking to a ghost. "We need to talk about last night." Vincent nodded. He placed his cold coffee cup down on the railing, the gesture deliberate, as though he were signaling to her that there was no need for more discussion. His fate had already been sealed. He had already accepted it hours before she arrived. "Nothing to talk about, Sarah. You know what happened. You know why it happened. Now you do your job, and we'll face what comes next." Her eyes flickered to Anthony and Michael. They were silent, just like their father, their faces etched with the same resigned acceptance. They had all made their choices, and now they were bound to them. "Where are the weapons?" Sarah asked, her voice low. Anthony stood without a word, walked into the house, and returned a couple of minutes later. He held a duffel bag in his hand, setting it at Sarah's feet without hesitation. The bag was heavy, laden with the tools of their vengeance. Inside were 4 handguns, 1 shotgun, and 2 revolvers. The weapons that had been used to execute their wrath, surrendered without resistance because resistance was now pointless. The blood had been spilled. The debt had been paid. Prison was just the price of revenge, and they had calculated that cost long ago. "You're all under arrest for 15 counts of first-degree murder and aggravated assault," Sarah said, her voice steady but laced with sorrow. She read the Miranda rights from memory as if by habit, but the words carried none of the usual formal distance. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Vincent stood slowly, his face impassive, and extended his hands to accept the handcuffs. He didn't flinch. The man who had once commanded fear from everyone around him now stood before Sarah, a broken man in the shadow of his own actions. Carmela appeared in the doorway just then. Her face was a portrait of grief, tired, hollow eyes, ravaged by sleepless nights and the weight of losing everything. She watched her husband and sons being led away, her heart breaking for them, but also for herself, for what she had lost, and what they would all face in the years to come. Sarah didn't need to say anything to Carmela. There were no words left to offer. She had witnessed the destruction of this family firsthand, but it was not her place to soften the blow. She turned away without looking back, her heart heavy with the knowledge that this arrest, this moment, marked the end of something far greater than she could ever explain. The trial of Vincent Moretti and his sons began in September of 1988 at a Brooklyn courthouse. This courthouse had seen its fair share of mob trials and gang prosecutions, but none had the same weight as this one. The Moretti family had been a symbol of the old neighborhood, the so-called family business, that had, for better or worse, become synonymous with the lives of the people who lived there. Now, they were on trial for 53 combined charges of first-degree murder, aggravated assault, weapons violations, and conspiracy. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They had ballistics evidence matching the recovered weapons to the shells found at every crime scene. Eyewitnesses had placed the Morettis near multiple locations during the murders. Keisha Thompson, a young woman who had once known Joey, had heard Vincent's voice and identified him from a photo array. She had tearfully testified about watching her boyfriend tortured and executed while she hid, too afraid to act. She had called for help, but it had arrived too late. The medical examiner provided clinical details of the deaths, the victims' ages, the specific wounds. The families left devastated. There had been 15 victims in total. The youngest was 17-year-old Ramon Rodriguez Jr., Maria's baby brother. He had been at the diner caught in the parking lot ambush and had died holding his brother Luis's hand. The images of the victims haunted the courtroom, families destroyed by a revenge-fueled spree that had left no mercy for anyone caught in the crossfire. The defense, led by Anthony Caruso, a criminal defense attorney known for his work with organized crime figures, argued that their client had acted under extreme emotional disturbance. They painted Vincent as a man pushed to the edge of sanity by the murder of his youngest son, Joey, during a peace meeting, a betrayal that shattered his ability to distinguish right from wrong. They brought in psychologists who testified about PTSD from Vincent's military service and the trauma he had experienced holding his son as he died. They argued that the neighborhood codes, which had once been his guiding principles, had been violated by the disciples in a way that left him with no moral clarity. The defense also called character witnesses to speak about Vincent's good reputation before the violence began. They described him as an honest businessman, a loving father, and a neighbor who had always been there when people needed him. They painted a picture of a man who had never been involved in serious crime until his son had been murdered by people who had once been his friends. The prosecution wasted no time dismantling this narrative. Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, 38 years old and known for her surgical precision in court, took the jury through the planning that had gone into the murders. She explained how Vincent had acquired the weapons, drawn up detailed surveillance notes, and even written out a kill list in his own handwriting. She pointed out that the systematic killings of 15 individuals over 9 hours across 7 locations could not be dismissed as a crime of passion. There had been nothing spontaneous about the killings. Jennifer also emphasized the innocence of several of the victims, such as Shanice Davis and Ramon Rodriguez Jr., who had not been involved in any way with Joey's death. They had simply been at the wrong place at the wrong time. She asked the jury to consider that extreme emotional disturbance did not explain the meticulous planning, the execution-style murders, or the torture of Marcus Williams. It didn't explain the deaths of innocent teenagers who were simply caught in the crossfire. The jury deliberated for 31 hours over 4 days. It was clear they struggled with the magnitude of the decisions they were being asked to make. In the end, they delivered a unanimous verdict of guilty on all charges. As the judge prepared to pronounce the sentence, the courtroom sat in tense silence. The Morettis had become something more than a family. They were symbols of a code, a myth, that had led them down a dark path from which there was no return. The consequences of their actions, however, were only beginning. Vincent Anthony Moretti died at the Greenhaven Correctional Facility in Stormville, New York, on March 17, 2015. He was 85 years old. After serving 27 years of his life sentence, Vincent never once applied for parole, as the terms of his conviction made him ineligible for such a request. He had been imprisoned for the murders of 15 individuals, the aftermath of a tragic tale of revenge, violence, and the destruction of a family. In those years behind bars, Vincent's reputation as an unrepentant mobster had softened, transformed in a strange way that baffled those who had known him before. Prison guards reported that in the years following his arrival at Greenhaven, Vincent had become a model inmate. The once feared figure in the streets of Brooklyn had retreated into the quiet of prison life, spending much of his time in the library. He tutored other inmates, teaching them how to read and write, using his skills to help others build lives beyond the walls. To many, Vincent was a far cry from the violent man who had orchestrated the massacre of 15 people in one night. But to those who knew his history, it was as though he was running away from something, maybe from the ghosts of his past or from the blood-stained legacy that haunted his every thought. In his 60s, Vincent found solace in Catholicism. He attended Mass every Sunday, without fail. He spent hours each week in solitary reflection, his thoughts perhaps filled with regret, but more likely with an attempt to reconcile the man he had been with the man he was now. He wrote letters to a Jesuit priest, seeking guidance on questions of justice, mercy, and sin. His letters were filled with a quiet yearning for absolution, yet also a subtle defiance that suggested his actions could never be fully undone. It was this conflict that seemed to define his last years. He never truly came to terms with the enormity of his actions. Instead, he clung to the belief that he had done what he had to do for his family, however misguided that rationale may have been. The night before his death, Vincent had experienced what prison staff described as a quiet moment of clarity. He had been speaking with the prison chaplain late into the evening about the nature of sin, the possibility of redemption, and whether some sins were beyond forgiveness. As the conversation ended, Vincent quietly expressed his feelings about his family, his sons, and his own past. The chaplain, a man who had seen countless inmates come and go, had become accustomed to the range of emotions that flowed through Vincent. But there was something in his voice that night, a finality in his words, that left a lasting impression. At 4:32 the following morning, Vincent Moretti's heart finally gave out. The death certificate listed heart failure as the official cause. In the hours before his passing, Vincent had whispered something to the chaplain. According to the prison's records, his last coherent words were, "I still see Joey's face every night. Tell my boys I'm sorry it cost them everything, but I'm not sorry I made them pay." It was a cryptic statement, one that reflected the complexity of the man. It was a mixture of guilt, regret, and stubbornness. A declaration that he could not, and perhaps would not, renounce the path he had chosen. His sons, who had been a central part of his life, his revenge, and his downfall, would never fully understand the pain he carried in his final days. But it was clear that the weight of his actions never truly left him. Vincent's death came after years of reflection, but also years of regret. He had long stopped trying to justify what he had done. He simply lived with it. Prison became his penance, and while he never said it outright, it was evident in the quiet moments he spent writing letters, reading scripture, and walking the narrow halls of Green Haven. He accepted his punishment, perhaps not because he believed he had to, but because he had nothing else to hold on to. It was as if the violence of his youth had finally caught up with him in a way that he couldn't outrun. Anthony Moretti, the second eldest of Vincent's sons, was released from Sing Sing Correctional Facility in December of 2028. After serving 40 years of his sentence, he was 68 years old. By the time he walked out of those prison gates, Anthony was a broken man. He had entered prison in his 20s, full of anger and the fire of youth. But the decades of incarceration had stolen those years from him. He had become institutionalized, a shadow of the man he had once been. The Anthony who had once been a force of nature in the streets of Brooklyn was now a ghost of that version of himself. He moved into a small, dimly lit apartment in Bay Ridge, living alone in the same neighborhood that had once been home. The familiar streets felt alien now. The life he had once known was a distant memory. Anthony got a job washing dishes at a diner on 3rd Avenue, trying to make ends meet. His days were filled with an overwhelming sense of emptiness, as though his purpose had evaporated along with his youth. Former neighbors who remembered him said that Anthony seemed like a shell of the man who had once commanded respect. He shuffled through life without any real direction, waiting for death to reunite him with the family he had destroyed in the pursuit of protection and revenge. There was no joy in his life, no hope. The guilt over his role in the murders of 15 people never left him, and the thought of what his family had lost, what he had lost, hung over him like a constant shadow. He rarely spoke to anyone, and when he did, it was often in monosyllables. Anthony had become a recluse, an invisible man trying to blend into a world that had moved on without him. Carlo Moretti, the third son, remained incarcerated at Attica Correctional Facility. At 66 years old, he had been denied parole 4 times, the most recent in 2023. Carlo's time behind bars had not been easy. In his early years of incarceration, he had been violent and unruly. He was involved in numerous disciplinary violations, ranging from physical altercations to the smuggling of contraband. His reputation in prison was one of fear and intimidation, and he had earned the respect of his fellow inmates through sheer force of will. But as the years passed, Carlo began to mellow. The violence that had once defined him had been tempered by age and isolation. By the time of his most recent parole hearing, Carlo had settled into a quieter routine. He worked in the prison kitchen, kept to himself, and did his best to avoid trouble. Still, the weight of his past, his involvement in the killings, his betrayal of the principles his father had taught him, was a burden he could not escape. Carlo's situation was not much different from Anthony's. They were both trapped in lives that had been forever altered by their father's choices. And much like Anthony, Carlo rarely spoke of the past. What was there to say? The damage had been done, and the family's legacy was one of violence and bloodshed. In prison, Carlo kept his thoughts to himself. though he occasionally allowed a few words to escape in letters to his surviving family members. These letters often contained vague references to regret, but they never went into detail. Perhaps, deep down, Carlos still had trouble facing the man he had become. Michael Moretti, the youngest of the brothers, was the most tragic of them all. In 2009, he died by suicide at Clinton Correctional Facility. He was 51 years old. For decades, Michael had struggled with depression, guilt, and the unbearable weight of his past. He had been hospitalized multiple times for self-harm, and prison records showed that he had been a deeply troubled inmate. He had spent his years in isolation, disconnected from the world outside. The emotional toll of the murders he had committed, coupled with the constant reminder of the family he had helped destroy, had pushed him to the brink. Michael's struggle with his conscience was evident in the years leading up to his death. His suicide note, obtained by journalists through a Freedom of Information Act request, was heartbreakingly brief. It read, "I see their faces every single night." There were no words of apology, no grand gestures of regret. It was a simple, haunting statement that conveyed the depth of his suffering. For Michael, there would be no redemption, no peace. His death was the final tragic chapter in the Moretti family's story, a family bound together by blood and revenge, and ultimately destroyed by it. Carmela Moretti, the matriarch of the family, lived until 2003. She was 74 years old when cancer took her life. In her final years, Carmela visited Vincent religiously. Every Sunday, she made the 2-hour drive to Greenhaven, sitting across from him in the visiting room. Their conversations were often mundane, talking about nothing and everything. But they were a lifeline for both of them. After her health declined, the visits stopped. Carmela spent her final years alone, reflecting on the family she had lost and the choices she had made. The house on Coffee Street, where she had raised 4 sons and buried one, became a place of memories and regrets. Carmela's death marked the end of an era. The Moretti family had once been a symbol of power, respect, and fear. But by the time Carmela passed, there was nothing left of that legacy but empty rooms, broken hearts, and a legacy that had been irrevocably shattered by the choices made in the name of vengeance.